Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bowes. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is the legislative wrap-up edition of Washington Policy on the Go. We had to delay a little bit for some technical reasons, so I apologize for that. I'm just going to give people a chance to connect with us now that we've started the webinar. As always, if you have a question at any point in our conversations with our center directors, I hope you will enter that into the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen. That's the easiest place. Some people use the chat. It's a little harder, and I can't guarantee I'll see that one. But if you use the Q&A box, we'll be able to use that one, no problem at all. So at any point, if you have a question, make sure you put it in there. Also, even though this is the legislative wrap-up session, I'm sure we'll talk more about the impacts of the legislature. I want to alert you, there's a new Viewpoint magazine coming up next month. We'll have some written material on the impact of the legislature that you'll be able to see from the various center directors' perspectives, including our new Center for Government Reform Director, Chris Corey. He also has a new blog posted right now on our website, washingtonpolicy.org, which is of interest. It's the highs and lows of the 2023 legislative session, and he makes a really good point. He talks about how the state concluded this biggest spending in state history, and the claim is that they've done it without taxes, which is technically true, but there's a lot of growth in the budget, as in increased spending, that's due to taxes that were passed last year or the year before and are just coming into effect this year. So even though we're being told that there's no new taxes, it's not going to feel that way because you're paying new taxes. Some of them are a bit hidden, like the emissions tax that you're paying in gasoline. Todd has written about that fairly extensively, about how incredibly high that impact has been on per gallon of gasoline and per gallon of diesel. I remember people being upset by 5 cents. Well, this is nothing. You're talking about 39 cents. Some big impacts per gallon, and that's part of what you're feeling. Also, we have the new income tax on capital gains kicking in to allow for greater spending. And soon your workplace, your human resources department, is probably informing you now about the coming payroll tax that Elizabeth Hovde, our Center for Worker Rights and Center for Healthcare Director, has been warning you about for some time. So, and we'll talk with her in just a second. We'll also talk with Pam Lewison. She is our Center for Agriculture Director, about two things. One, I just want to get a wrap up of anything that happened ag-related in the legislative session. But also, there's a story that had me laughing out loud in many ways. That tells you what happens when adults can't make adult decisions, and she frames it in an agriculture story. So we'll talk with her about that coming up as well. Anyway, but by all means, make sure you check out the new blog from Chris Corey, our new Center for Government Reform Director. It's the highs and lows of the 2023 legislative session. I'm going to put that link into the Zoom chat box here in just a second, and make sure that you can see it right there. All right, so now you have no excuse. You can't miss it. Everybody's going to be able to see it, and there you go. All right, now let's bring on Elizabeth Hovde. She is our Center for Worker Rights Director and Center for Healthcare Director. Let's start with the payroll tax. In our company at Washington Policy Center, we just got the email, today, hey, employees who weren't able to opt out, we have you on board. We have you notified, and I got one of those because I've said many times I wish I wanted to opt out. I finally got through to one private insurance provider, but they weren't offering private insurance at the time, and that was pretty much all I had time for. So it was too little, too late on my part. So I'm stuck with the tax. And you're seeing that too. You're expecting people all around the state to be informed about this and be relatively surprised, right?
Yeah, I'm really glad that employers are doing the job that lawmakers chose not to do and the state chose not to do, about informing people about this tax and how it's going to hurt them. They've been more interested in creating affinity for the tax and trying to make us love it before it begins. And really, this much energy should have been put in at the very beginning to let people have some options, but that wasn't the intent. I don't ever think. Some of us got out, which was not their intent, and they're having to run around and make a bunch of changes because of that. But it's good that, you know, employers are at least telling people that you should budget for this, because it's not a small tax. It is going to hurt some people, especially people on the edge.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that people on the edge is an increasing number these days. And
Right.
I went grocery shopping recently, and it once again reminded me of whenever I hear about inflation being low, and then I look at the packages and look at the shrinking packages and the escalating prices of some basic things, you know, like a jar of jam. I think I paid $9.75 for it. I was like, I would never have done this a couple of years ago. It was crazy. So
I've been asking my clerks at the grocery store, because I feel like it is absolutely double. I spend double for half the bags, and I'm like, do you really think that? And they're like, yeah, it's double at least.
oh yeah, and I'm seeing people like never before putting things back, and it breaks my
Yeah.
heart each time. When you'll see people in line and they look uneasy when they get the bill, and then they start putting things back on
I
and
do
saying,
it.
I can't take this, can't take that. So you know, it's a reminder that, you know, small taxes and small changes to policy that increase expenses matter. And I think
Absolutely.
oftentimes policymakers forget that.
Like Chris Corey, I wrote a blog recently that there's no new taxes, but it's certainly not going to feel like that. And Senator Linda Wilson has an excellent paper out that shows the various higher taxes that come into effect this year, 2023, on income, property, sales, and driving. So there's all these taxes that lawmakers are going around, some of them, and saying there's no new taxes. This is a successful budget, but their spending is higher, and we're going to feel like there are new taxes. There's no way around it.
Well, let's talk about the legislative session and how it relates to workers' rights. You know, one of the things you point out is, despite the claim that Washington State is, you know, the leader when it comes to putting science first and following the science when it comes to policy, there was no change made on the vaccine mandate, and that's despite the fact that we know for a fact that, and we have known for some time, that you can get the vaccine, and that doesn't mean you're not going to contract COVID. It doesn't mean you're not going to spread COVID. It just means that your risk of being hospitalized is reduced. Hospitalized from COVID is reduced by that vaccine, but no change from the state. Was it ever even close
To being ended?
Yeah.
Oh, no. The Biden administration too just announced that they are no longer going to require a vaccine mandate on their workers in healthcare facilities that receive Medicaid or Medicare. So that's going away. It was just announced. On May 11th, also the federal vaccine requirement for federal workers, federal employees, and contractors and international travelers goes away, along with the emergency order stuff on May 11th. And so I hope Inslee is paying attention and listening. I have some notes into his communication staff saying, I'd really love a comment about this today. Does this move at all the consideration that this will go away? Our workforce is suffering. You know, we've already ruined some people's careers and family budgets over this. That's not happening now because they're already all shoved out of state work. But now it's still in existence for new hires. So we are excluding our hiring pool in a time where our workforce is short-staffed. It makes no sense. We need to get rid of this. People can contract and spread whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated. And that's really the bottom line. If I'm vaccinated, I can show up to work and give someone COVID just as easily as someone who's, you know, fired and not able to work there because of it. So
yeah, that's what upsets me so much. I've known first responders and others who, when there was no vaccine and when they didn't even know what was going on, they didn't know what the death rate was going to be and all this kind of thing, they were still showing up to work, and oftentimes showing up to work with overtime, going
Yep.
directly into places without hazmat gear, but they just had their masks and other things, trying to keep from spreading it. But they did it at great risk to themselves, or an unknown risk to themselves.
Yep.
And then, then they find themselves a year later being told that they're the bad guys, that they need to be punished. And then, shortly thereafter, when it was very clear from a scientific point of view that there was no real rationale for this approach, they're still being told, well, you're persona non grata here. So it seems to me to be a very political and spiteful kind of approach.
It's
here.
heartbreaking, even when it went into effect, we already knew that people who had the vaccine were contracting and spreading before it even went into place in October of 21, I think. So it's been misguided from the beginning. We have not followed the science. We have not cared about the science. We've cared about the political message, and it's not fair. And what was really remarkable to me during that time, a year and a half or so ago, was the governor kept saying, listen to your provider, talk to your provider. And I talked to providers. They were saying they were not going to get the vaccine for whatever reason, X, Y, or Z. I'm vaccinated. One of them told me not to get it because of joint issues I have and inflammatory situations that COVID would cause if I got COVID, or the vaccine would exacerbate. And anyway, long story short, he told us to trust these people, and then they weren't trusted at all. They were fired because they didn't get the vaccine. It's amazing to me.
Me too. It's sad, I think. I think there's still a political divide between people. I still see people.
I did too. And I blame the top for that, right? The stigma was created by saying over and over again that you're not doing your part if you're not vaccinated. And that was just spread, and until it couldn't be spread anymore, when we realized both unvaccinated and vaccinated people carried the disease. And then it changed to hospital resources. You're hurting hospital resources. And we have still yet to see the full number outcome of that, right? It hasn't been long enough. What we know, and we know for sure, is that this disease impacts the elderly, and they are the ones most at risk. And a whole message campaign could have done that without stigmatizing young people who chose not to get the vaccine because the benefits didn't outweigh the risks for them.
Yeah, and there's been some. It's like a political litmus test now, where people are sticking with it in order to create political points to keep old fights going. And that's not the way especially this kind of public health policy is supposed to be made, because if you lose the trust of the people and they see it as, which it's lost.
Exactly.
People lose the trust. Then when something else comes along and you need people to listen to you, that is not what they're going to do. They're going to
That's the hardest part, right? We've just set ourselves up for failure the next time around. Yeah. And it's heartbreaking, because I really do think in the beginning, people were making the best judgment decisions they could. It's the fact that we've ignored all the science that's come in between there, and the results and the outcomes and the numbers, and we're not tweaking the policy according to all these things that started with good intentions, but now just looks stupid.
Yeah, and there's no surprise. I mean, whenever I talk with Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director, about environmental policy, and he'll point to the data showing that some policy is costing a lot more than it benefits, and you could accomplish the same thing at a fraction of the cost. But there's an attitude in politics where they just dig in because there's other political interests. They got the headline that they wanted. Their side, so to speak, is all excited about policy X or Y, even if it doesn't really work.
Right.
So they stick with it rather than actually accomplish something. And that's
the other thing I keep asking the governor's office is, when they show me the criteria by which he has this authority to do this without legislative guidance or votes, I asked, does he therefore have the authority to mandate exercise per week for people, because people who aren't as healthy have more heart attacks, all those kinds of things? Like, at what point do you not have authority, or you do? I'm trying to understand that. I don't understand why it would be off limits for anything. The number of drinks you have a week, how much food you're taking in, if you're going to the doctor regularly. I mean, what are we willing to impose on workers? What are workers' rights? You can't have a job if you don't do these 3 things. I just don't understand how we can say that this lines up with the RCWs. When I read them, it does not.
Yeah, and you've got, you've got people that were doing snow plowing work alone on mountains, and they're still being punished. I mean, that's crazy. But consistency hasn't been a virtue of our state policy of late. I mean, you have to get parental consent for a number of things, aspirin, Tylenol, field trips and the rest. And it's being stripped away for life-altering surgeries and other things. So there's all kinds of things happening that do not fit with consistency. Let's turn quickly to licensure. You pointed out in your recent legislative wrap-up blog that research from the Institute for Justice found that the state requires Washington state requires more government licenses to work in a larger number of job categories than any other state. That was really big to me. I mean, I suspected we weren't, we weren't one of the less regulated states, but we're way up there when it comes to making it harder for people to work. I thought that was really a fascinating insight on their part.
We're way up there. And, it was interesting to me when I was looking into House Bill, I think 1009 is the number, and it was an easement for licensure for military spouses who have licensing for an occupation in another state, and getting it expedited when they come here because they move and go and need to be able to pick up and work and all that. But when I'm reading through the specifics of this law, it starts telling me the background and in the bill report, and it had, I think, at least 10 agencies that were outlined there. I can't remember, I wrote it in my blog, and each one had, occupations underneath it. It was just so thick. It's something we need to address. Sometimes licensing is for safety and protections, and sometimes it's to keep competition out, and sometimes we've really got to make sure these licensing certification things are something that allow people to get to work reasonably and aren't for nothing.
Yeah, you pointed out more than a dozen of these agencies regulate a plethora of occupations. So when you're trying to weed through all these different agencies, trying to figure out, where the regulations are, it becomes more and more complicated. This is something that Senator John Braun brought up, I think about 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago. He did a release and an examination of how the regulatory burden in Washington State is growing, and he stacked up a bunch of books like War and Peace and the Lord of the Rings trilogy and other things. And the growth of regulation had far surpassed, these massive works that would take you forever to read. And, and we're expecting people to keep up with that, which is not realistic. And it's better and easier to start, streamlining now and reducing the complexity than it is to just let it keep caking on. Because it ends up being one of those things where no matter what you do as a business, you're always going to be in violation in some way. And it allows for kind of the tyranny of the civil service, basically, where they can just find something wrong and keep picking at you. So that's not healthy.
And to leave licensing on a good note, there were several bills that passed that ease licensing standards for various occupations with adequate training wrapped up in it. And a lot of these, several of these that I looked at were in the healthcare department, and they were things that they saw the military pilot programs doing well, seeing other states do well. So they got unanimous support in some situations. There were still the naysayers who came out to testify against the bills, but it does seem like they're moving in the right direction.
Let's go to your category of misguided moves on your blog here. You point out Senate Bill 5236 said the state intervening in hospital workplace situations that it knows little about and questioning the judgment of professionals in the field. What does that mean exactly?
That means when this bill started, it was basically a lot of people thought a union negotiation holdover that they were asking state lawmakers to grant for employees of hospitals. So when employees were given choices between different work benefits and situations, they opted for pay in some situations, not these different staffing models. And now the lawmakers have intervened and tried to create a staffing commission for hospitals that has a different weighting of the nurses that are on shift, who work there versus the admin picked people or the administration itself. So they're trying to give more of a balance in that work staffing ratio negotiation. And what we've argued for a few years, it's a way better compromise bill than it started. And I think even the Washington State Hospital Association got on board with it, but I think they got on board with it because the alternative was that the state was going to regulate staffing ratios that then they would owe fines for if they did not follow. And when you're in a hospital, a lot of times you can't follow a rigid staffing schedule. And nurses wouldn't want to, admin wouldn't want to. There's an ebb and flow there that state regulators shouldn't be involved in.
Yeah, that makes it really tough because these characters are not in the hospital. They don't know, what what's going on, and wanting to interfere on that micro level is so painful. I can imagine why they might make a move in favor of something, even if they didn't really like it, for the reasons that you stated. It's just, it seems like that's always it's the slow death by 1,000 cuts, because
Right.
the other stuff always comes back. Once they got the other thing that they want, then they aim at it again, and you just keep getting hit.
And
So,
every industry should be concerned, right? Right
right.
now, hospitals are the boogeyman and they're the ones making profits, and we're going to go after their employees that make too much money and et cetera. But, it could be any of us.
Yeah, and hospitals are getting hit hard. I mean, a lot of them they were prevented from, speaking of, just a little while ago, we were talking about the impact on hospitals from COVID. Well, one of the impacts of hospitals from COVID was the inability to do other surgeries and other kinds of procedures that matter to their bottom line and enable them to provide free service to people who can't pay for it. I use the term free very loosely there.
Right.
And to be able to keep their doors open and provide the kinds of services that other people need. Let's move on quickly, because I know I promised you a quick exit, because I know you've got a very busy day. You also pointed out House Bill 1200 would require employers, at least public employers, to provide employees' personal contact information on an updated basis. But that's only to union reps, right? Not to people who
Yes.
might want to remind them of their right not to join the union, right?
Right. The requirement is for public employers to give out public employee information to bargaining representatives. And, there's a valid point to be made that workers in public jobs need to know that these unions exist and they can be a part of them if they would like to be. But there's already an orientation that's required under law that they get to come give a captive group of people, and there's access to these employees to let them know they exist and they have their work information. But many of the employers also have, your 3 mobile phone numbers that you use for your kids. And we don't need to be giving out that information or addresses, in my opinion.
Well, just to hit your thankful miss portion of your analysis of the 2023 legislative session, you point out House Bill 1045 bit the dust. That's the basic income pilot program. And, while you point out that it bites the dust, how fast do you think that'll be back? Let me put it that way.
Oh, I think it's a statement making bill that will always be back, right? It shows, it allows a lawmaker or two to show that they care about these people who they have told are not able to achieve more. And that's depressing in itself. Any social program comes with this belief that it's better to be stuck in poverty. It's not. We want people rising out of poverty, and we need to be creating programs that help do that, not that help them stay in poverty. And so that's a disturbing one.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth. Appreciate your time today. I want to encourage everybody to read her synopsis there of the 2023 legislative session. I just shared the link in the chat function there, so you can save it for yourself. There's a number of points that we didn't get to, but that's okay. All the details are right there online at washingtonpolicy.org. Thanks, Elizabeth. Appreciate it. Appreciate your work this session too. All right, real quickly, Jeanette wanted to chat with everybody. It says, I have gas receipts for January, $3.69 a gallon, and April, $4.35 a gallon, 66 cent per gallon increase. Yeah, I mean, Todd's been working at trying to isolate how much of those increases are due to Washington State's policy versus, say, demand or other things happening overseas. And he's done a great job of that. And the amount is extremely significant. I mean, it blows me away that story has been buried, basically. Is not, I mean, imagine if it was labeled correctly and just called a gas tax, that would be a huge story, but they don't see it at the pump, because it's on the back end. And so it's able to just kind of snuggle into the malaise of the current era of inflation and other things instead. Let's bring Pam Lewison, our Center for Agriculture, on. Pam, you had a story. I'm going to give a synopsis of this story that I read online, and then I promise I'll ask you about an overall impression of the session. But you have this story online about why it doesn't have to be cruel to harvest meat in agriculture. And you tell the story of this little girl who brings a goat to the fair, and the little girl, she's competing in a 4-H kind of competition or FFA, something or other, and she brings the goat in, and she successfully sells it. It's it's a respected animal, and she's done a good job raising the animal. And then after she sells it, she realizes, it finally dawns on her that the animal that she's now grown to feel affections for is going off to be used as meat somewhere. So it's going to be killed. And she changes her mind. The problem is she changed her mind after it was sold. And so the mom, instead of explaining to her, hey, this is what happens, it's going back and forth, they start trying to find a way out of it. And they offer a full reimbursement of the price to the person who bought the goat. That person says no, that they want the goat. That's what they were at the fair for. And then they hijack the goat, they kidnap the goat, take it home. Then they move it because they know that the sheriffs are going to be coming. So they send it to a sanctuary, they move it. And 2 sheriff's deputies are in hot pursuit of this goat that they're trying to get back over the course of a couple of days. And the whole thing is just a ridiculous mess. And you just point out, Pam, how almost no adult in this story that you've related online makes any adult decisions whatsoever. From the sheriffs who are, here they are spending. I mean, I related to it because I had some stuff stolen from me at one point. My sister had some stuff stolen, a brand new laptop. And even though the, Find My Laptop said it was at, the guy's house across the street, was a drugger, basically, kitty corner, they wouldn't go in there and get it, versus this goat that, that they've sent a couple of deputies to go chase down. The story is unintentionally very funny, I think. And then, as you point out, just there's nobody making any decent decisions in this thing.
What I thought was interesting is, I'm a product of a decade of 4-H. So, we've always raised animals, and the lesson there always was give your animals the best life you can, knowing that at the end of it, they're still going to end up on our dinner plate. It doesn't mean that they didn't have names or that we didn't care about them, but ultimately, they are food, and they're intended to be food. So what I thought was bizarre about this story is that you have all of these adults around this little girl who come at this from their own perspective, but none of those perspectives take into account that there are lessons that each one of them could be imparting to this child. And ultimately, that what it does is open the door for animal rights activists and, people who believe strongly in not eating meat as a lifestyle, it gives them, armor to sort of say, hey, look at this cruel thing that all of these grown-ups did to this little girl in pursuit of a goat. And is this really the kind of, food production chain that we want to participate in? And, the answer is, I don't even want to participate in that, right? And we grow livestock for meat. So it struck me that what you have are, there are certainly some fairs where there are policies in place that if you sell an animal, it is no longer yours. Your last responsibility is to turn it out into a communal pen so that it can get loaded up and shipped off for slaughter. That's not a bad thing. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But you have all of these people who have turned what is already a challenging experience into something that is, quite honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this little girl is scarred for life.
She's hunted by police, her parents are in trouble by
Right.
police. Nobody just pauses to say, you know what, this is not a war crime. Let's everybody just take a deep breath here.
Well, and I think it's incumbent upon anyone who is in that position of being a consumer of a meat product, and I don't care where it comes from, but you need to be willing to explain to your child what you're entering into when you go down this line of raising and selling an animal for meat, that you should care for it. It should be something that you give your love and attention to, but ultimately not so much of it that you're unwilling to turn it loose, because it does have a purpose, and that is to feed other people.
There's a similar, there's a similar thing that goes on with hunting. I remember as a kid hunting with my grandfather. I think the first time I had the rifle with me I was probably 12, and killing my first deer, and you feel the weight that you're taking the life of an animal. And that, there's a mixture. There's the happiness of a successful hunt, and then there's the sadness of taking a life. But I think it gives you a greater appreciation for all things. I've never looked at packages of meat in the store as just packages of meat. I've always looked at it like, those were cows, those were pigs, those were chickens. And I think that's that the kind of experience that this little girl was having there is healthy and good. And by the way, it's the same thing for anybody who thinks they want to go vegan or something along those lines. They should have to harvest some of this stuff with a combine and see what happens to fields and stuff when you're plowing them under and harvesting. This, it is not like there's no animal on earth that's not harming other animals when they're eating. Just it's part of the cycle of life.
There's a Facebook page I follow called the Punk Rock Farmer, and he's great because one of the things he talks about is just that people who choose to be vegan or vegetarian, and that's there's nothing wrong with that, but the notion that there is no animal life that is harmed in that is just not true. The number of field mice and other rodents and bugs and snakes and other things that are still part of the life cycle of plants, and that they get in the way when they're being harvested or, whatever the case may be. We need to, I think, be a little bit clearer that, just because you happen to be vegan or vegetarian doesn't mean that you are not also in some way culpable potentially for, a loss of life. And so it's more about making sure that you are understanding how those things work and being grateful for, the sacrifice that goes with that.
Yeah, and I think that gratitude is important, and I think it leads to things like, you're seeking better care for animals, you're trying to minimize any kind of pain or cruelty and other things. I think some people tend to view animals in an anthropomorphic, Disneyfied sense, like I remember interviewing a lady about chickens, and she basically wanted them to have their own home or something. And chickens are basically dinosaurs with feathers that that run around and are quite mean to each other, even if they've got a lot of room to roam. And I've seen that over many years. But hey, but before, and I just shared the link to this story in from your blog to everybody, so you can check out this story. It reads like a weird zany film, because the guy buying it's was a state legislator of some kind, some politician, and the whole thing just reminds me of like it's a mad world, the 4F edition, or 4H 4H edition. But any thoughts on the overall legislative session before we wrap it up here when it comes to agriculture? And I know there's a number of things of concern to you going in. Your overall thoughts on your way out.
I think this session was rough for ag legislation. We had some great things happen in legislative committees. I think the House Ag Committee is a shining example of what the legislature should look like. Having consensus that's bipartisan and having cooperation amongst both parties. That is what that's kind of the ideal, right, for what legislation should look like and what a legislature should be, is two parties coming together to compromise, ultimately with the goal of benefiting the people who are going to be impacted by whatever piece of legislation it is. In that case, the buffer bill, it was effectively a third try to come up with a buffer bill that was acceptable to both the ag community and tribal communities. And the folks that were in charge of that negotiation did a great job. Unfortunately, it died. It died in the Senate, which means that we're sort of left with this question about what buffer bills are going to come next, and having to sort of have some sense of defense rather than being able to just move forward. And I think that it's interesting that we talk about the fuel price. Agriculture right now is still being illegally taxed for these carbon bills, and so there was no true fix offered, and I think we're still going to be in a little bit of limbo with that post session. And certainly, I think overtime legislation is something that we still need to have discussed in a broader sense. The overtime flexibility bill had a single hearing in the Senate Ag Committee, and it was a disaster. Whether it's misinterpretation of what people are saying, or casting agricultural employers as being racist, both historically and presently. I think those are things that need to change fundamentally. We need to have a better understanding of agriculture, how it functions. And until we have that, I think, things like the overtime piece of where we're at on a labor market are going to continue to be really challenging. We're at 48 hours this year. We'll be at 40 next year to reach that time and a half, the time and a half trigger. And there's, as people are losing their other forms of income and things are getting more expensive, whether it's groceries or anything else, there is, there's a real serious issue there with farm workers being able to earn the money they need to earn to make a living, but also their employers being able to continue to pay them in a manner that befits the work they're doing.
Well, if I remember right, one of the testimonies that you mentioned, there was a legislator that was providing some interpretation, which really shouldn't happen. I mean, a legislator should be providing the interpretation for someone speaking, to them, especially, and if they do, there should be absolutely no editorial comment involved in it. And what happened was the legislator decided to insert her own view on what they really meant, rather than what they were actually saying, which You
Well,
know,
I
I'm
think that
surprised that's not an ethics problem.
the most egregious part of that is that there was at least one state certified interpreter in the room, if not more. And that person was effectively ignored instead of being invited up to the dais to give interpretation for that remote testimony.
Yeah, that's inexcusable. Well, as always, I appreciate your time, Pam. I know as a farmer, you've already been busy this morning and are going to be busy again. So we'll let you go. I put the link to your blog on the chat function there. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about the impact of this legislative session coming up. I hope to have our new Center for Government Reform Director, Chris Gorey, on. He had another engagement today, but we'll get him on here pretty soon. Now, remember, the legislative session is over, so we're doing Washington Policy on the Go every other week now. So starting, next week there won't be any Washington Policy on the Go. The week after there will be, and so forth, unless you get an email. We'll send an email out if there's some special reason why we're doing a special update. We'll send you an alert. Other than that, you should just watch for them every other week from here forward until the next legislative session or until a special session, which is still being talked about. So we'll find out about that next. On behalf of all of us, we thank you for listening and watching, and hope that you'll go on and we grab this video from our YouTube channel and share it with friends, or at least a portion of it with friends. And they'll see us in 2 weeks here for Washington Policy on the Go. Thanks for watching, everybody.